Committee and the House Commerce Committee on House Substitute for Senate Bill 9 will come to order. Our ranking member is in another conference committee, but on his way shortly. So while we're awaiting his arrival, if we could have a brief explanation of the bill from the reviser.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The bill would establish the Kansas Land and Military Installation Protection Act to prohibit foreign principals from acquiring interests in real property within 100 miles of military installations, except for de minimis interests. The bill defines key terms such as country of concern, de minimis interest, foreign principal, real property. Specifically, residential real property would be expressly exempted from the definition of real property. Residential real property would be defined as real property that is used exclusively as a place of residence for human habitation. Interest in real property would be defined to include both ownership interests and interests acquired by rental agreement. Foreign principals would be required to register any such interest with the Attorney General within 90 days of acquisition. The bill would require foreign principals failing to register or improperly acquiring property interests after the effective date to divest their interests. The Attorney General would be empowered to investigate violations and enforce divestiture through court actions. The Secretary of State would be required to provide notice of the registration requirement to all business entities and nonprofit organizations when they file documents with the Secretary of State. Foreign principals who have an applicable real property interest on July 1, 2025, and don't register in time, instead of immediately being subject to divestiture of their interest, would get a warning from the AG and then have 30 days to register. This warning requirement would expire on June 30th, 2028. Additionally, the bill would prevent foreign principals from receiving benefits from economic development programs, which is a defined term. The Attorney General would be tasked with reporting non-notified transactions and submitting annual reports on the Act's implementation. The Fusion Center Oversight Board would be authorized to adopt rules regarding foreign terrorist organization designations. The Kansas State University would be required to report annually on foreign land holdings within the state. The provisions of the bill concerning interests in real property and receiving economic development program benefits would be subject to a severability clause. And then lastly, Section 4 of the bill would prohibit a governmental agency from purchasing or acquiring drones or related services, maintenance agreements, or equipment if the critical components are produced in a country of concern or produced or owned by any foreign principal. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. And it's, the bill is kind of two pieces, if I'm correct, procedurally. One is the foreign adversaries' investment in owning real property, and the other component is drones and their component pieces.
Yes, Madam Chair, they started out as separate bills and we combined them both for efficiency. Thanks.
Thank you. And this concept, the reviser can fill in the gaps here, but this concept has been around the last couple of sessions and has been in Senate Judiciary in a couple different forms, and then in Senate, Fed, and State as well. This session, it was, we had only time due to the short time frame of session to have an informational briefing on Senate Bill 9 in its current form. So I'm thankful for the reviser explanation of the bill, and have had some conversations about the I hate calling component pieces because there's pieces of the bill and then there's component pieces of drones and things. So, so the Senate has not had an opportunity to, amend it in committee or on the floor or otherwise, or to work it. But I do think that our side has been talking with some of the stakeholders, and I think there are at least maybe 2 amendments to maybe consider. So, and I think Senator Titus has one if we could discuss it, not probably ready to make the offer yet, but if we can discuss that, that'd be great.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in reviewing the bill, we thought there were two probably major changes, and then not necessarily major, but two substantive changes and then a clarification. The first was on page 3, we would strike the definition of foreign entity that was only used to define a single word in a definition, and we just tweak that. So on page 2, in the definition of de minimis, line 24, we just changed that from foreign entity to foreign principal, which slightly narrows that, but we didn't think we needed that in there. And then we struck the definition on page 3. And then the biggest change would be page 4, line 30. We'd consider a new subsection B there, and this would be a process to allow if you're an existing corporation and registered under this act, it would allow an expansion if it's reviewed by the governor in consultation with the Fusion Center governing board and the attorney general. And it gives the governor 90 days to decide if that expansion would be no threat to military installations or critical infrastructure. So just to accommodate some of our people that are already going to be here and grandfathered in. Those were the two changes on that. The only piece we had talked about in the drone bill was there's a review by locals that would go to the adjutant general, or excuse me, go to the Secretary of Administration right now. In consultation with the adjutant general, we thought we should just change that to the Division of Emergency Management, since they have the local connections and they're going to have on-the-ground technical expertise rather than run that through the Department of Administration, which doesn't deal with the municipalities very often. So conceptually, that was, then there were a couple other moving sections around things like that we had talked about, but for clarity.
Do you have any questions conceptually about some of those?
Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it would essentially just be like a different, like a registration process for current companies, and then it would kind of apply to the governor, or what process?
So companies that are already registered under this act and they want to expand, so they're already here, they're already registered and lawfully operating. If they wanted to acquire new property to expand, then they would apply to the governor. The attorney general would lay out the process, I believe, for all of this act. So
I think conceptually I can understand it. If we could have a copy of the amendment to review before our next meeting, that would be good. And if there are any other suggestions or amendments, we'd be happy to entertain those at the same time so that when we come back, we can come to an agreement. Thanks.
Yes. Explain to me, part of the other kind of conceptual amendment to consider is in the drone section of the bill. Been talking with law enforcement, and sometimes they already have bids out for contracts to purchase critical components from the drones they already own, and hearing some concern about the date of July 1, 2025 on page 10 of the bill at line 40. So how was that determined? And that would, I'm hearing then the law enforcement community would have to stand down and not make any further purchases to maintain, or I think would be to replace any of the component parts. So tell me about the July 1, 2025 date.
I think I'm going to ask the revisor to talk about how long they have to replace parts.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From what I understand is that critical components that are have been purchased from a foreign principal can be used as replacement parts as long as those parts were purchased before the effective date of this act. So they could still be used. And then the contract provision simply says, the provisions of this section shall not apply to any contract or agreement entered into prior to, again, July 1, 2025. So the terms of those contracts could continue on.
So I'm looking specifically on page 10, lines 37 through 41, a question for the revisor, that if after July 1, 2025, that there's a need for a replacement component for a drone already owned by law enforcement, that there wouldn't be an opportunity to replace other than with a non-foreign principal.
So one applicable provision, again, would be if that prior entered into contract is applicable. There's also additional leeway given in subsection C at the bottom of page 10, at least from what I understand, how it would apply. Any acquisition that is otherwise prohibited under subsection A or B may be completed if the governmental agency, and then has a list of different criteria that could allow them to still get those replacement parts.
Thanks for that clarification and that explanation. I mean, clearly our goal, it seems, of the House and its position in Senate Bill 9 is to keep foreign adversaries from acquiring Kansas land within 100 miles of military installations, which is an important goal, and we want to make sure that we're doing that right. That's my thought for the moment. So currently, was there any testimony on whether there were American-made component parts that would be able to service the drones that already are owned by law enforcement here in Kansas? Was there any conversation about that, or any new companies who might come online with American-made only parts here in America, but that wouldn't be able to meet the July 1, 2025 deadline?
Yeah, there was plenty of discussion around that. There are many American companies that are now creating drones, building drones. They are ramping up production, and the only issue is that they're going to cost more. But the committee weighed the weight of safety for American people and for Kansas over cost, and it's going to take some planning, and it's going to take. The city of Lawrence was one of the ones that came to testify that it would get expensive, and it's going to take the Lawrence City Council to prioritize the police force if they want to go forward with it.
Was there any testimony also that, I've heard some that with the date as written in the bill, that then if law enforcement were looking for other American-made, by American-made companies here in the U.S., that they would need additional time and wouldn't be able to use currently the drones they have, for instance, for searching for missing persons, for sending drones out to be first responders for our law enforcement. Was there any discussion around that?
There was discussion, and there's plenty of opportunity for them. Last year's bill is a lot different than this year's bill. This year's bill allows them to use their current drones for as long as they want. And they can buy parts for them. They can contract for parts for them for years out by July 1st, 2025. That gives them a lot of time to plan for this. If they don't plan for it, then they wouldn't be able to buy parts that they're not already contracted for. But those contracts can be written in a way that would allow them to continue to move forward and replace parts on them. They just won't be able to buy new drones. There's also exceptions in here if it becomes near impossible to get them because of the demand. There are exceptions built into the bill so that we can prioritize their safety along with American safety.
And as I mentioned before, I mean, the goal is safety from foreign adversaries with this bill. and for our law enforcement to also have the opportunity to perform their duties in a safe manner as well. We're going to confer on our side for just a minute, if I may. Well, I guess I may, because chair of the committee, so we're going to confer for just a moment. To have a different conversation with the House Chair for a moment. So thank you for the opportunity to let us step outside for a moment. Were you asking for the microphone, Mr. Chair? Sure. So I think if we can pass out the amendment that I think we already did regarding what Senator Titus has shared, and then a conceptual amendment to be added to that in the Senate offer regarding the date on the drone part of the bill. And I can ask the reviser. Where in the bill we would need to take a look at to push the date back from July 1, 2025 to, again, we were hearing from of our law enforcement community that to be able to effectively do what they need to do and keep their officers safe, that they were asking for a December 31 date of, they were asking for 2026. But I think in keeping with the goals of the bill, December 31 of 2025 in section 12. And I think for purposes of clarity, it's probably easier rather than the December 31 deadline, make it July 1st of 2026 rather than July 1st of 2025. And we're presenting this amendment in addition and with the amendment that was discussed by Senator Titus. Again, the Senate didn't have any opportunity to amend this in committee or hear it on the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you tell me what page and line that you're talking about, a section 12?
Sure, I'll ask the reviser for that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The date change is not reflected in the balloon that was passed out to you. So I believe what Senator Warren is talking about is this balloon plus that conceptual date change, which would be on page 10. There would be a couple date changes there in lines 35 and 40. And then you would probably want to, in conjunction with that, change the contract provision that Kyle mentioned. So you'd want to make probably a matching change on page 11 and line 11.
Thank you. So that's line 35 on page 10 and line 40 on page 10, and then line 11 on page 11. Thank you.
Okay, so I know it's a conceptual amendment, and we'll chew on this for a while and come back to you on that. However, I would say that you probably don't want to change 35 because we still want them to have purchased the drone before the deadline. And you're wanting to extend simply the date, and from what I'm hearing, simply the date of acquiring parts for the drone for 1 year.
Correct, and thanks for that clarification, the date for replacement parts.
All right, I think we understand the conceptual amendment, and we have the written amendment. I do have a question is on part of the written amendment.
Go ahead.
On page 2, striking foreign entity and changing it to principal to narrow it. I'd like to ask the reviser to explain what the ramifications of that might be.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Currently, a foreign principal who would have de minimis interest in a property would be exempted from the restrictions of the bill. And that term is defined to mean interest in real property that is, 1, the result of ownership of registered securities in a publicly traded company, and two, A, less than 10% of securities, or B, a non-controlling interest in an entity that's controlled by a company that is not a foreign entity. Foreign entity is defined elsewhere and is suggested by this amendment to be stricken out as, one moment, any company whose domicile is any country other than the United States. And so the way I would read that, I think it would ultimately be a policy decision for the conference committee where one, a foreign principal could have a de minimis interest if they have less than 10% of any class of registered securities, or B, a non-controlling interest, which could be up to 49%, and say, in this instance, Saudi Arabia could have the controlling interest. They fall underneath the definition of foreign entity, which is in the current bill, but they wouldn't fall underneath the definition of foreign principal. And so it's up to, I think, the conference committee to decide if that's a situation they would want for someone to have a de minimis interest under this bill.
Further questions, Chair Tarwater?
I think I understand it. Thank you.
Okay, you sure, Senator Titus?
Yeah, just the thought was it would encompass countries, he used Saudi Arabia, and maybe not necessarily the best example, but like Sweden or Canada, they get looped into this definition, but they don't have any requirements under this. So we're really concerned about, if you look under the definition of foreign principal, it includes a corporation, it includes the countries of concern. I think all of that's encompassed under foreign principal definition. So it just seemed cleaner to just remove that definition and then the one reference to it, which is in another defined term.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay. I think I understand what your intent is, and I think I understand what the reality is, and we'll have to chew on it and come back with something that might work. But I understand, I think, what you're looking for now. Okay.
Thank you. The Senate is scheduled to caucus at 1:30. I don't know what the House's schedule is. 1:30 also. And then this committee has a conference committee with House Judiciary at, well, right now 1 o'clock, but we're trying to move it to 12:30. So do you want to meet upon second recess of the second chamber?
Let's do that. It'll give us enough time to hash it out and maybe reword a couple of things.
All right, then. So we will reconvene upon the second recess of the second chamber today, and we will try to meet in this room, but don't know if we have that yet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Either we could have either one of your committee assistants can assist with getting the room.
So stay tuned for the location. And with that, then, unless there's other business to discuss at the moment, we are adjourned.